Hey, welcome to 23 Degrees Sideways, Coyote in the Valley. We're going to talk some more about grass-fed cows, steers, beeves in this case. We talked a little bit about Vital Farms butter, Kerrygold butter, the idea that people have for marketing that the cows sit on pasture all the time, 365 days a year, the grass is always growing, and it's always spring in Ireland or Maryland or Indiana or wherever, Texas, right? Because Texas is just the greenest state ever. Sure. And, I got a comment about grass-fed beef coming from Texas. So we're going to talk about that. It's a little bit of a different thing, and it has some different standards, okay? According to the USDA, and this does not appear to be regulatory enforceable, administratively enforceable, but what's supposed to be the definition of grass-fed or forage-fed means that grass and forage are the primary or only, this is kind of a gray area, feed source consumed for the entire lifetime of the ruminant animal, with the exception of milk consumed prior to weaning. The diet shall be derived solely from forage consisting of grass, annuals and perennials, forbs, legumes, brassicas, browse, and that means pretty much anything that the cow will eat or the steer will eat, which is a big deal out west because there's a lot of open range, and we'll get to that. Or cereal grain crops in the vegetative state. Now, most of your cereal grains, all of your cereal grains are grasses. They are grass, okay? It's kind of funny to say grain-fed by wheat and corn when those are literally grass. It's just that those are the seeds of the grasses, the grains of the grasses. Specifically, you're dealing with the vegetative state. So you can get wheat hay. Wheat hay generally does not have any grain heads in it. You can. Wheat and barley hay will come with that, and it's actually really healthy and still counts, but it's kind of a dodgy in between. There's a lot of stuff that goes on when you start getting into feed, and we'll talk about that here. So animals cannot be fed whole grain or grain byproducts and must have continuous access to pasture during the growing season. Now, that's an interesting thing. Cows, steers, beeves, I'm trying to get back away from dairy talk for a minute. Beeves, plural beef, which is a animal, like a cow or cattle or steer or bull. Beeves generally go through a multi-year life cycle. Goats, on the other hand, you sometimes will harvest in 10 months. So even, it's really easy to do a grass-fed goat, for example. Now, forbs, so legumes and brassicas, okay, are a common forage feed, more common than grasses in a lot of cases. So this is one of those areas where grass-fed is something that if you're pedantic and you're in farm, if you know cattle agriculture, you kind of laugh or twitch a little bit because everyone's like, grass, alfalfa's grass. I'm like, no, alfalfa's not. It's a legume. A forb, depending on how you want to describe it. There are often supplements that don't seem to matter early in a calf's life. So a calf will be fed, the milk until weaning. There's often some additional quality or density or protein in the feed that's going on. So even if you're doing forage feeds, so hay, basically bales of hay, because quite often your calves are born in the winter. January is a very common calving season, for example. You'll find that there's not a lot of grass growing. It's actually winter. And winter actually has a meaning and exists outside of cities when you have to deal with the environment. So the feed, and it is feed, we just all call it feed, will often be primarily hay, and you'll see people dropping half-ton bales into the pastures. And these pastures are actually fields that are used to produce alfalfa as a hay crop in the summer, but in the winter and early spring, before they actually till the fields, they're used as winter pasture, open pasture, and then they just drop the feed, the hay, and supplements off. You'll have something called a mineral block. So a mineral block or a mineral tub will often contain like 17, 19% protein. So it's minerals and protein, and it's a feed additive. It's absolutely a feed additive, and that's very common. Very, very common. So you'll find that. You'll also find special qualities of feeds in certain areas, and you'll know when you're looking at that, because there'll be fences that are at certain heights with certain gaps, so the calves can get through, but the cows can't. Okay, and they'll get higher protein, denser feed for better growth. Okay, this is all still grass fed. All still grass fed. Grass fed also can mean, so grass fed in a marketing term can mean that the animal, the beef, is predominantly on pasture. So in the Southwest, that's pretty common. A lot of cattle spend a year and a half, 2 years in the desert. Just in the desert, in the mountains, just wandering around, eating whatever's out there. Okay, that technically it's grass fed, even if they're mostly eating cactus and shrubs and, well, there's a lot of legumes that are actually trees out here. So they'll be eating that. Very little actual grass, because the grass doesn't really grow so much. But that's considered grass fed. And then they'll be grain finished. There will be a few months in a lot getting kind of fattened up, some marbling, some flavor, because people actually like their meat to be a little bit tender and a little bit fatty, a little bit marbled. And that'll be grass fed, but it's not 100% grass fed. Okay, when you talk about 100% Texas grass fed beef, you're dealing with something that eats a lot of hay and spends a lot of time in a lot, in a corral, in a fenced area, eating. Feed, not browsing forage. Doesn't mean that's necessarily bad, okay? There are seasons. There are times when stuff grows, doesn't grow, and that's just life, okay? Notice what the USDA says, okay? Continuous access to pasture during the growing season. What that means is when the forage, grass, whatever, is growing, they have access to pasture, and pasture can just be open range, okay? It can literally be the mountains in the middle of Nevada. Lots of cattle out there. And you'll often supplement the feed because there's just not a lot to eat out there, but that is continuous access to pasture. It doesn't look like a Kentucky horse field, okay? So there you go. That's basically it. Key points about 100% grass-fed. Okay, and then there's grass-finished. I need to go back up a step. Grass-finished is another term, which is usually sometimes used to refer to that last 2%, 5% of the beef's life being open pasture, access to pasture and hay and forage and silage. I mean, there will be feed, preserved feed. That's going to be part of it. So that's grass finished means that end stage is not grain fed. You can have grass fed and grain finished, and you can have grass fed and grass finished, and grass is still, again, something of a misnomer. It could be mostly prickly pear cactus for all you know, right? So moving forward from that, the advantages here, okay, what's really going on here isn't so much about the feed. Cattle aren't force-fed and force-grown the way chickens and pork are, okay? Pork and chicken are in commercial, modern industrial farming are absolutely horrible. I'll go into that in another video. There's a theory here about lifespan and how much they can process their feed. Cattle in general have enough lifespan that you're not going to have the feed be the meat. I'm going to have to get into that when we talk about 5-month pigs and, processing pigs after 5 months and how fast they grow and how much you're force feeding them and all of that. Different video. So cattle have a long time to process their diet. And that's leads to a higher quality nutrition product. The meat's better. All right, no matter what you're doing with them, the meat is generally better. There are, there are downsides to feedlots. Absolutely, in terms of meat, taste and quality and nutrition value. But a lot of what's going on here is actually just exercise, space, air, and lack of crowding. You'll have a lot lower biological contaminant load with free range and or grass-fed and or grass-finished beef. Now, free-range open pasture doesn't necessarily mean grass-fed or grass-finished. Grass-fed is kind of a default for cattle in the United States anyway, for large periods of lifetime. You can have open range and still be feeding feed. So our last couple of cattle when we were on the farm, before we sold it, our last couple of head, they ate the pasture. They ate the hay, the forage, the baled forage. So alfalfa hay, wheat hay, different kinds of hay. They ate weeds, but they also ate a protein mix. Basically, they wet cob, corn, oats, and barley. It's rolled oats, corn, barley with molasses, with sugar, right? It's a winter feed, wet cob. It's actually, I used to eat it as a kid when I was really young. When we had the suburban farm, you'd actually scoop it out and eat it. It was actually sweet, kind of like molassesy oatmeal. Okay, so cob, and that's a grain feed. But it's an open pasture, fantastic meat. When we butchered those, they were absolutely fantastic. No problems. So I don't have a real problem with having some grain in there. Technically, that was not 100% grass-fed, grass-finished, but it was an open pasture, primarily grass-fed, grass, legumes, whatever, primarily forage-fed. Cow, 2 cows, and a steer. So our last 3 head were all of that. And 2 heifers, I guess. I need to remember how to use the words properly now. Fantastic meat, but technically grain fed, but you couldn't really tell. They process the feed very well. They're long-lived animals in terms of agriculture. But they were in a low-density environment, low biological load. They weren't confined. They weren't crapped up. They weren't walking in their crap. They weren't walking in mountains of manure. And you can see this when you go to feedlots. So their biological contaminant load, their worm load, their bug load, whatever you want to call it, parasite load is very small. They're no strain-resistant bacteria, very, very healthy meat. Higher levels of omega-3s, and that's not because that they ate more or less grain, it's because they were outside walking around doing their thing. Higher levels of vitamin D, higher levels of, what are the other, I need to look this up. There's some other nutrients that are in there, Blah, 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 blah. Oh, this is horrible. I'm looking at some websites while I do this. And there are nutritional benefits, okay? So, CLA, that's conjugated linoleic acid. linolenic acid, and that is higher in open pasture beef, not necessarily just grass finished. There's no downsides, of course. Higher levels of vitamin E, the B vitamin complexes, potassium, and magnesium. Now, magnesium's a little bit iffy, depends on the source and where you're at, because that can actually be magnesium depleted soils, especially if there's a lot of hay in the forage. Okay, if there's less browse and more hay, because you're dealing with something intensive grass farming to raise grass-fed cattle. So that's all that. Here's the basics, the takeaway from this. Grass-fed beef should mean that it is fed primarily a forage diet, open forage diet in season, with low density environments, corrals, pens, whatever you want to call them, confinement spaces, in winter seasons or non-growing seasons, eating primarily good quality hays and forages, baled forage. Should be the whole life cycle. However, there's grass-fed grain finished, which is traditional agriculture, but generally they try to actually make it a little bit better on the grain finish part. Traditional Western beef agriculture, that is. There's different things in different parts of the country. And then there's grass finished, which usually means grass fed, grass finished, but can include, of course, nutrition and calorie supplements early in life or during different phases of open range grass fed living. So, those mineral tubs with the extra protein and sugar, the cob, having cob sprinkled over the hay during the winter, whatever it is. And then the other form of grass finished refers to grass fed and grass finished 100% of the life period. And then there's traditional grain fed, grain finished, which, depending on your location, pretty much often in America, often means grass fed, grain finished. That's it. Now, 100% should mean 100%. So if you get 100% Texas apparently is a marketing term, because Texas is not actually that great as cattle country, to be honest. But it's a big state with a lot of open range space, so that's what it is. 100% Texas grass-fed beef should mean 100% grass-fed. The Texas thing, whatever. Beef from Kentucky is probably actually going to taste better. So, whatever. I eat most of my beef from the Mountain West, so west of Texas, because this is where I've lived most of my life, whether it be in California or Washington or Nevada or Arizona. Lots of cattle, lots of mountain pasture, open range, that's federal lands, thank you Teddy Roosevelt, where cattle go out and do their thing and eat for years. Sometimes these things don't get rounded up for a year and a half, okay? They're out there, right? They'll get tagged when they're born, and they'll get branded at some point in time. Real cowboys out here. So that's what you're looking at. Grass-fed does mean something. It's not a total marketing term. It doesn't always mean exactly what you think it means, but it's a generally good picture of an animal that is going to have higher nutrition value than a completely confinement raised animal. Okay? And beef is, in general, not completely confinement raised. That's just the nature of cattle. They take a couple of years, you let them loose in federal lands, you round them up once in a while, and that's it. That's it. That's all I got for you. I hope you learned something. All right? Stay sideways.